The stagecoach groaned as it rattled over the rocky trail into Red Rock, a town barely more than a cluster of weathered buildings baked beneath the endless western sun. Dust rose in spirals behind the wheels, clinging to the air like memory, the kind you couldn't wash off. Inside, Clara Whitfield sat stiffly with her gloved hands folded tight in her lap as if holding herself together. Her dress, once fine and pale blue, was now dulled by the journey, its hem torn from the long days of travel. Her face, though young, bore the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from miles. It came from being unloved. She had left everything behind in Charleston, her family's white-columned house, the polished halls, and the suffocating expectations that had pressed on her since girlhood. Her father had always said, "A woman's worth is in her obedience." Clara had dared to disagree, and for that she had lost everything. Her downfall began the night she broke off her engagement to Thomas Avery, a wealthy banker's son whose charm melted the moment he claimed her as property. He had called her difficult, ungrateful, a woman with too much mind for her own good. When she refused to bow to his demands, he destroyed her reputation with one whispered lie. Within a week, society turned its back on her, and her own father said coldly, "If you walk out that door, you walk out of my life." So she did. Now, as the coach rolled to a stop in front of Red Rock's small depot, Clara stepped down into a world utterly foreign to her, wide, raw, and unwelcoming. The sun beat down on her bonnet, and the air smelled of horses, smoke, and something wild. Men leaned against hitching posts, eyeing her like she was a riddle they didn't care to solve. A woman with a clean dress and city posture didn't belong here, and they made no effort to hide their stares. Clara lifted her chin. Her pride was the only thing she had left, and even if it was cracked, she would not let it fall apart here. The first person she spoke to was the innkeeper, a large woman with arms crossed tight and a skeptical eye. Clara asked softly if there was a room for rent and work to be found. The woman frowned. "Work for you? Don't know if there's call for city girls out here. Town's full of women who can cook, clean, and keep their mouths shut." It was said without malice, just the plain cruelty of survival. Clara nodded and thanked her anyway. She had learned that pride didn't feed you, but begging didn't suit her either. She dragged her trunk to the edge of the boardwalk, the wheels catching in the dust. Her hands trembled. From exhaustion or humiliation, she wasn't sure. She looked down the street and saw men moving in and out of the saloon, the blacksmith's hammer ringing steady in the distance, a few children running through the alleyways. Life went on, and different to her suffering. It was then, across the street, that she noticed him, a man leading a chestnut horse toward the livery. His hat was low, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't stare like the others. He simply noticed. There was something about the way he paused, as if seeing her without judgment, that made her chest tighten. She didn't know yet that his name was Luke Bennett. She didn't know that this quiet cowboy, this man with hands roughened by work and eyes softened by loss, would one day be the one to say the words that would heal her. "In my cabin, you'll be loved for who you are." For now, she was just a woman standing alone in a town that didn't want her, with dust on her hem and fire in her heart, a stranger at the edge of something that felt almost like hope. The first time Luke Bennett saw Clara Whitfield, she looked like a ghost from another life, too fine for this hard land, yet somehow carrying the same kind of loneliness that he wore beneath his hat. He had come into town only for supplies, nails, feed, maybe a coil of rope, the kind of errands that filled a quiet man's day. Luke wasn't much for talking. Most folks in Red Rock called him the quiet one from Bennett's Ridge, a man who lived alone in a cabin tucked between the cottonwoods and the hills. He didn't correct them. Silence suited him. It kept people from asking questions about the past he didn't want to discuss, the wife buried under the oak tree and the laughter that, Used to live in his house but hadn't for years. That afternoon, the sun hung heavy and low, turning everything gold except for the pale, weary figure dragging a trunk through the street. The sight stopped him where he stood. She was trying to move her things toward the livery, her back straight with pride, but the way she stumbled told the truth. She was exhausted and alone. Luke watched her for a moment longer than was proper. There was something about her, not just the city dress, or the fine gloves already dirtied by dust, but the way she refused to look defeated. Most folks who came west looking that lost usually broke within a day. But not her. She looked ready to fight the whole desert if she had to. When her trunk slipped from her grasp and landed in the dust, a few men on the porch of the saloon chuckled. Luke's jaw tightened. He crossed the street without thinking. "You'll wear yourself out that way," he said, his voice low and steady. Clara turned, startled. Up close, she saw the rugged lines of his face, sun-browned skin, dark stubble, and eyes the color of the deep earth after rain. They didn't leer like the others. They watched, careful and kind. "I can manage," she said quickly, her voice tight, clipped by habit. Luke didn't argue. He simply lifted the trunk as though it weighed nothing and set it near the porch steps. "Didn't say you couldn't," he replied, meeting her gaze. "Just figured you've done enough heavy lifting for one day." That was all. He tipped his hat, nodded once, and turned to leave. Something in the quiet way he walked away, no demand for thanks, no curious questions, struck Clara harder than kindness ever had. It had been a long time since anyone had helped her without expecting something in return. Later that evening, she saw him again at the general store, standing near the counter while the shopkeeper tallied up his order. He didn't talk much, but when he noticed her hesitating by the door, clutching her empty purse and a list of prices she couldn't afford, his brow furrowed slightly. When he stepped aside to let her pass, their shoulders nearly brushed. For the briefest second, their eyes met, hers full of wary pride, his full of quiet understanding. Red Rock was not a kind place to newcomers, especially women with secrets. Luke knew that look, the guarded way a person acted when they'd been judged too many times. He'd seen it in the mirror once, after burying his wife and hearing the whispers that he'd loved her more than the land, more than his duty. When he left town that evening, Luke caught sight of Clara again, standing outside the inn, arguing softly with the keeper. No work, no room. The look on her face, that flickered between hope and humiliation, followed him all the way home. By the time he reached his cabin, he already knew he'd ride back tomorrow, not out of pity, but because something in her silence had answered his own. By the third day in Red Rock, Clara Whitfield had learned that the West was not as wild as people said. It was worse. It was quiet in its cruelty, slow and sharp, a place where people smiled to your face and cut you to pieces once your back was turned. At first, she thought she might find her footing there. She woke each morning in a small room above the livery, its thin walls letting in every sound, the hammering of hooves, the calls of cowhands, the rattle of the wind through the cracks. With her few coins she bought bread and coffee, and by noon she'd already begun her search for work. But every door she knocked on seemed to close tighter than the last. At the general store, Mrs. Farnsworth wrinkled her nose when Clara asked if she might need help stocking shelves. "Afraid not," the woman said, her tone sweet as honey and twice as false. "We don't hire travelers, not unless they come with good references." At the small schoolhouse, the teacher gave her a long look, one that lingered too long on her fine gloves and educated speech, before saying, "We're full up, miss. Perhaps the saloon might have use for a woman of your refinement." That word, refinement, came out like an insult. By sunset, the town had begun to whisper. She heard it as she passed the saloon porch, half-drunk men muttering, women leaning close to gossip. She came in from the east, someone said. Didn't come with a husband. Too proud to work, too pretty to starve. A few laughed. She won't last a week. Clara kept her chin high, even as her stomach twisted. She was used to gossip. She had survived worse in Charleston, but something about these whispers cut deeper. Back east, cruelty was dressed in silk and polite conversation. Here, it was bare and loud, spoken in daylight. She was halfway down the street when a familiar voice called her name. Miss Whitfield. It was Luke Bennett. He stood outside the smithy, hat in hand, sleeves rolled up, the afternoon light catching the dust on his shoulders. She tried to compose herself to look less defeated. Mr. Bennett, she greeted, though her voice trembled slightly. You find what you were looking for? He asked. His tone was calm, steady, as though he already knew the answer. She shook her head. No one seems in need of help. I suppose they have all they require. Luke studied her for a moment, then said, Folks around here can be slow to trust new faces. Takes time. She forced a smile. Time I don't have, I'm afraid. He hesitated, thumb brushing the brim of his hat, then said, I could use an extra hand out at my place. Cookin', maybe a bit of help with the house and the horses. I can pay fair. Clara blinked, taken aback. You don't even know me. Luke shrugged. Don't have to. I know you need work, and I could use help. That's enough. For a long moment, she said nothing. Every instinct told her to refuse to guard herself against another man's pity or power. But something in Luke's eyes held no demand, no expectation. Just quiet decency. I'll think about it, she said finally. He nodded once. You do that. I'll be heading back before dawn. If you decide yes, meet me by the livery then. When he walked away, Clara stood motionless, feeling the weight of a decision pressing on her chest. The whispers of Red Rock still buzzed around her, stinging like flies, but for the first time since she arrived, she had a choice that didn't come from fear, one that might just be the beginning of something new. And though she didn't know it yet, saying yes to Luke Bennett's quiet offer would change everything that followed. The sun hadn't yet risen when Clara Whitfield stood outside the livery with her single-worn trunk and the faint hope that she wasn't making a mistake. The chill of the early morning bit through her shawl as the world still dozed in silence, except for the distant nicker of horses and the low hum of a man's voice. His voice. Luke Bennett appeared through the misty dawn like he belonged to the land itself, steady, unhurried, calm. He greeted her with a nod, his hat pulled low over his brow. You came, he said simply. Clara's gloved hands tightened around the handle of her trunk. You said to meet you before dawn, she replied, her tone cautious but resolute. Luke gave a half smile, almost hidden beneath the brim of his hat. I did. Let's get you settled. He lifted her trunk onto the wagon without effort, the muscles in his forearms flexing as he tied it down. He didn't make conversation, and Clara found she preferred it that way. Too many men filled silence with words meant to trap you. Luke seemed to understand the peace that came with saying nothing at all. The journey to his ranch stretched nearly an hour beyond the town, past rolling fields, dry creek beds, and quiet patches of cottonwoods whispering in the wind. The land was wide and lonely, but beautiful in its vastness. Clara sat stiffly beside him, every turn of the wagon wheels echoing her own uncertainty. When they reached the cabin, she was surprised by its simplicity, a sturdy structure built of pine, its roof freshly mended, smoke curling gently from the chimney. It wasn't grand, but it felt real, alive in a way that city homes never were. Chickens pecked in the yard, and a brown Murray lifted her head from the fence to watch them arrive. Luke hopped down first and offered her his hand. Welcome to Bennett's Ridge. Clara hesitated, then took it. His palm was rough, calloused from years of ranch work. but his touch was steady. Grounding Dot inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and saddle soap. It was clean but sparsely furnished. A table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, a bookshelf with only a few titles, and a worn rug beneath the window. It was the kind of place made for silence. "You can have the spare room," Luke said, motioning to a small door at the end of the hall. "Ain't much, but it's yours." Clara stepped inside. The room was small but tidy, a narrow bed, a quilt, and a single window overlooking the hills. For the first time in months, she set down her trunk and felt a flicker of safety. Over the next few days, life at the ranch fell into a rhythm. Clara cooked, swept, and learned the feel of the place, the sound of the wind at night, the lowing of cattle in the morning, the quiet between Luke's words. He never raised his voice, never gave orders, only suggestions. Still, Clara couldn't help but feel uneasy. She caught herself watching him, trying to decipher the silence he carried. It wasn't coldness. It was something deeper, like a man haunted by memory. When she asked if he wanted company at dinner, he only smiled faintly and said, "Don't mind quiet." Got used to it. Some nights she thought of leaving. The cabin felt too intimate. 2 souls circling around each other, afraid to speak too loud. But every morning when she stepped outside, the air was crisp, the sky endless, and Luke was already working. Steady and constant as the sunrise. One evening, as she cleared the table, she found him standing by the doorway, hat in hand. "You work hard," he said softly. "You don't owe me more than that." It was such a simple thing, yet it struck her to the core. For once, a man wasn't asking for her obedience, her gratitude, or her body, only her presence. For Clara, that was both terrifying and tender, the start of something she didn't yet have a name for. By the time the leaves began to turn brittle in the dry wind, Clara Whitfield had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life at Bennett's Ridge. Dawn came early. The rooster crowed. The horses snorted awake, and the air smelled of sage and smoke. She rose with the light, tied back her hair, and moved through the small cabin like someone who belonged there, though she still wasn't sure she did. Luke Bennett was a man of few words. He worked sunup to sundown, fixing fences, tending to cattle, or riding into town for supplies. He never demanded, never lectured, and that silence, once strange to Clara, began to feel almost safe. Yet it carried something heavy beneath it, like the hush before a storm. She noticed it in small things, the way he paused sometimes at dusk, staring toward the hills, how his hand lingered on the porch rail as if remembering something that wasn't there anymore. He wasn't unkind, far from it, but his quiet had depth, the kind that only comes from loss. One evening, a storm rolled down from the mountains without warning. The sky went black and wild, wind clawing at the windows. Clara hurried to bring in the wash before the rain hit, but Luke was already there, pulling the line free and tossing the wet linens over his arm. "Get inside," he said over the thunder, his tone gentle but firm. By the time they made it indoors, the storm was raging. Rain beat against the roof like drumfire, lightning splitting the dark. The air smelled of wet wood and smoke. Luke stirred the fire to life while Clara wrung out the towels, her pulse still quick from the rush. As she moved to hang them near the hearth, something glimmered on the shelf above, a small silver locket, half hidden behind a stack of old books. She hadn't noticed it before. It looked delicate, out of place among the rough-hewn cabin furnishings. Curiosity tugged at her. She lifted it gently, turning it over in her hand. When she opened it, she found a tiny photograph of a young woman, soft eyes, kind smile, the kind of beauty that spoke of goodness rather than vanity. She didn't hear Luke's footsteps behind her until he spoke. Her name was Maggie. Clara startled, nearly dropping the locket. I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "It's all right," Luke said quietly, taking it from her hand. His eyes softened as he looked at the tiny portrait. "My wife. Been gone near 5 years now. Fever took her." The thunder cracked, and for a long moment neither spoke. Clara watched his face, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his thumb brushed the locket like a memory he couldn't quite let go. "I used to talk more," he said finally, almost to himself. House was full of her laughter. When she passed, words stopped making sense. "Felt like everyone I spoke went nowhere." Clara's throat tightened. "You loved her deeply." He nodded once. "Still do, I reckon. But the world don't stop turning just because a heart breaks." There was no self-pity in his tone, just quiet truth. And something about that honesty undid her. For months, Clara had carried her own grief, not for a death, but for the life she'd lost, the love she'd never known, the pieces of herself she'd had to bury. And here was a man who carried his pain without bitterness. As the storm roared outside, she found herself saying softly, "I know what it is to lose something and have to keep walking." Luke looked at her then, really looked. Not as a stranger, not as a woman in his care, but as someone who understood the language of hurt. For the first time, his silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like a bridge. When the thunder finally faded, the two sat near the fire, saying nothing. They didn't need to. The truth had already passed between them, not in words, but in the quiet that followed. The storm that had swept through Bennett's Ridge left behind a strange kind of stillness, the air cleaner, the earth softer, and the silence between Clara and Luke changed somehow, gentler than before. In the days that followed, the two moved around each other with a new kind of understanding. They didn't speak of what had been said by the fire that night, about Maggie, about loss. But something quiet had settled between them, like the calm that follows a long, hard rain. Clara began to hum as she worked. It started unconsciously, soft and tentative. Little tunes her mother had once taught her before affection in that house had turned into discipline. At first, she thought Luke didn't notice, but one morning as she kneaded bread, he passed by the kitchen doorway and said simply, "That's a pretty sound." It startled her more than a shout would have. No one had ever called her voice pretty before. She'd spent years being told to hush, to speak softer, to let men do the talking. Now, in this small cabin in the hills, her voice, her being, wasn't just tolerated, it was welcomed. Their days fell into rhythm. Luke worked the ranch while Clara tended to the home and garden, though he never treated her work as lesser. When she mended his shirts, he thanked her. When she cooked supper, he washed the dishes. It wasn't what she was used to. It was partnership, quiet and steady. One afternoon, she found him repairing a section of broken fence. The sun was high, his shirt damp with sweat, his hat tossed aside. She offered him water, and as he drank, she caught herself watching the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. He wasn't a handsome in the polished way of city men, but there was something in him that drew her. The strength that didn't need to dominate, the silence that didn't feel cold. "Could you teach me?" she asked suddenly. He blinked. "To fix fence?" She nodded. "I want to learn. I don't want to be useless here." Luke studied her for a moment, then handed her a pair of gloves. Ain't no one useless who wants to try. The lesson was clumsy at first, the wire too stiff, the tools heavy in her hands, but Luke's patience never wavered. He guided her gently, showing her how to hold the pliers, how to loop and twist the wire without cutting herself. His hands brushed hers only when needed, but each time they did, her pulse skipped like a startled bird. When they finished, he looked at her with quiet pride. "Not bad for your first go," he said. "Fence'll hold," she smiled, breathless, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "So will I," she murmured, almost to herself. That night, over supper, Luke told her stories of his younger days, how he'd come west with nothing but a horse and a prayer. She listened, laughing softly when he spoke of the time his cattle broke loose and he chased them barefoot for 2 miles. In turn, she shared bits of her own story, carefully at first, then freely. She told him about Charleston, her father's cold house, the fiancé who tried to own her. Luke didn't interrupt or offer pity. He just listened, really listened. And when her voice wavered, he said quietly, "Ain't no shame in starting over, Clara. Takes more courage than most men'll ever have." Something inside her broke then, not the fragile kind of breaking, but the kind that makes room for light. She realized that she had stopped being afraid of his silence. It wasn't a silence of judgment or indifference. It was the silence of someone who saw her. By the time the moon rose, Clara found herself humming again. Luke leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, listening with that small, peaceful smile she'd come to know. For the first time in her life, she felt at home, not because of the walls around her, but because of the man across the table and the understanding that had quietly grown between them. For weeks, Bennett's Ridge had been a place of peace. The days stretched quiet and golden, filled with the hum of chores, the scent of earth after rain, and the kind of silence that no longer felt empty. Clara Whitfield had almost begun to believe that her past couldn't reach her here. Almost. But the past has long legs, and it always finds its way home. It began on an ordinary morning. Clara was hanging laundry near the cabin, the sun warm on her back, when she heard the faint rumble of hooves on the trail. She thought it was Luke returning early from town, so she waved without looking up. But when she turned, her heart froze. It wasn't Luke. A rider approached, tall, clean-shaven, his fine coat too polished for ranch country. Dust clung to his boots, but not enough to hide the smug set of his shoulders. Thomas Avery, the man she had once been engaged to marry. The man who had ruined her. For a moment, Clara couldn't breathe. The years fell away, and she was back in Charleston again, in her father's parlor, with Thomas's hand gripping her wrist and that cold smile curling at his lips. He dismounted slowly, tipping his hat with false civility. "Clara, my God, it really is you." Her voice trembled. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same," he replied smoothly, eyes scanning the land, and then the cabin. "So this is where you've been hiding. Quite the step down from the life you left behind, wouldn't you say?" His words carried the same poison as before, sweetened just enough to sound polite. Clara's hands clenched at her sides. "I'm not hiding," she said. "I left because of you." Thomas chuckled, the sound sharp and practiced. "Yes, that's what you told everyone before you ran off with my money." Her stomach dropped. "Your money?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't play innocent. The night you left, $1,000 went missing from my study. I might have let it go, but when a woman ruins a man's reputation, she ought to pay the debt." The lie hit her like a slap. "You know that isn't true." "Doesn't matter what's true," he said coolly. "Only what people believe." Before she could speak, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "Step back." Luke Bennett stood behind them, hat low, jaw tight. His presence filled the space like thunder rolling across a plain. Clara had never seen him look so still, so dangerous. Thomas turned, smirking. "And who might you be? The new keeper of Miss Whitfield's conscience?" Luke's tone was quiet, but there was steel in it. "I'm the man who owns this land, and I don't take kindly to strangers bringing lies onto it." Thomas laughed, though his eyes flickered with unease. "So she's bewitched another fool, has she?" "You don't know what she's done." Luke's gaze didn't waver. "I know enough. She's worked hard, hurt no one, and earned her place here. That's more than most can say." The wind carried the silence that followed, sharp and dry. Thomas's smirk faltered. "You'll regret defending her," he hissed. "She destroys everything she touches." Luke stepped forward, his voice low enough to make Thomas step back. "I don't believe in ghosts or gossip. I believe in what I see. And what I see is a woman you tried to break who's still standing." Thomas's face darkened, pride stung. He swung onto his horse with a final sneer. You'll regret this, both of you." When he rode off, the dust from his departure lingered long after the sound of hooves had faded. Clara stood trembling, her breath ragged. "He'll spread lies," she whispered. "He always does." Luke turned to her, his expression softening. "Let him talk," he said. "We'll face whatever comes." And as the wind moved through the cottonwoods, Clara realized something. Her past had found her again, but this time she wasn't alone. The next morning, the town of Red Rock stirred like it always did, slow, dusty, indifferent. But for Clara, it felt charged with tension. The arrival of Thomas Avery the previous day had left a shadow over her, a weight she could feel in every step. She had tried to ignore the whispers and sideways glances, but now they pressed in like the walls of a jail. She had almost resigned herself to retreating into the cabin, leaving the town to Thomas's lies, when Luke Bennett appeared at her side. He moved quietly, deliberately, but there was fire in his gaze, the kind of quiet strength that made a crowd listen without a word. "We're going to town," he said simply. Clara's stomach clenched. I can't. They'll believe him." "They won't believe him," Luke replied. "They'll believe what they see." Together, they walked toward the main street. The morning sun caught on Clara's hair, dust motes dancing in the golden light, making her look ethereal and real all at once. Townsfolk stopped their chores and paused mid-step, whispering to one another. The blacksmith put down his hammer. Children slowed their games, and the innkeeper peeked around the corner. Thomas Avery stood near the general store, smirking with the confidence of a man who thought the truth was his to manipulate. He straightened as he saw them approach, clearly expecting Clara to shrink back, to cower. Luke stopped a few feet away, his stance calm, measured, and yet undeniably commanding. "Townfolk of Red Rock," he began, his voice low but carrying, "I reckon it's time you heard the truth." The murmurs grew quieter. People leaned forward. "This here woman," Luke continued, nodding toward Clara, "did not steal anything from Thomas Avery. She did not run off with his money. What she did do was walk away from a man who thought she was property and not a person." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Thomas's smirk faltered, his confidence beginning to crack. "She's worked every day she's been here," Luke said, scanning the street. "She's cooked, cleaned, tended to my place, and faced every whisper and every cruel word thrown her way with more courage than most of you could muster. And yet some of you still doubt her?" The crowd shifted uneasily. Even those who had whispered behind her back began to see what Luke was saying. Clara's work ethic, her integrity, her quiet strength, undeniable. Thomas stepped forward, attempting to regain control. "You don't know what she's done." Luke cut him off with a steady gaze. "I know enough. I know she's stronger than your lies. I know she's braver than your threats. And I know this. Anyone who tries to bring her down again will answer to me." The tension was electric. Horses in the street shifted uneasily, and even the children sensed the weight of the moment. Thomas's face flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode off, his pride wounded, leaving the town to absorb Luke's words. A hush fell over the street. The people who had once whispered now exchanged looks, realizing the truth. Clara was not the woman Thomas painted her to be. She was strong, resilient, and most importantly, seen by someone who cared enough to stand for her. Luke turned to her, his voice softer now, almost private. "They'll talk," he said, "but that's all they can do. You've done nothing wrong. You've only lived your truth." Clara's eyes filled with tears, not of shame, but relief. The weight she had carried for so long, the fear of judgment and whispers, began to lift. For the first time in months, she felt free. And as they walked back to the cabin, side by side, Clara understood something she had never known before. Courage wasn't just about facing the world alone. Sometimes it was about letting someone stand with you. After the confrontation in Red Rock, the town slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But for Clara Whitfield, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The weight of judgment, the whispers of the past, and the fear of being misunderstood had lifted slightly, replaced by a new kind of uncertainty. She had survived Thomas Avery's lies, and yet a quiet question lingered in her mind. Could she truly find peace here in the hills with Luke Bennett? The sun was low when she reached the cabin, painting the hills gold and casting long shadows over the yard. Her steps were hesitant. She had thought about leaving, walking away from Luke, from the safety he offered, because she feared that staying might bring danger, or that she was somehow unworthy of the quiet love she glimpsed in his eyes. She paused at the gate, hand resting on the worn wood, and took a deep breath. Behind her, Luke's shadow fell across the porch. He had been watching her, quiet as always, patient, understanding. "You don't have to stay," he said softly, his voice carrying the calm strength that had always steadied her. "If you want to walk away, I'll understand." Clara shook her head, though tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid I'll bring trouble to you. Afraid that I don't belong here." Luke came forward, his rough hand brushing hers as he took it gently in his own. The warmth of his touch spread through her like sunlight on chilled earth. "Clara," he said, steady and unwavering, "in my cabin you'll be loved for who you are, not for what they say you should be, not for what you've lost, not for the mistakes others want to pin on you. Here you are enough." Those words, quiet, unassuming, yet full of promise, settled over her like a balm. For months, she had carried the weight of shame and rejection, feeling the sharp sting of judgment at every turn. And now, in the eyes of a man who had known loss himself, she saw the truth. She could rest here, without pretense, without fear. The cabin itself felt different as she stepped inside. The fire flickered gently, sending shadows dancing across the walls. The familiar scent of wood smoke and earth filled the space. She noticed details she had seen 1,000 times but never truly appreciated. The smooth tabletop, the neat rows of books, the worn rug that had softened under the tread of years. Everything spoke of care, of a life lived with quiet purpose, much like Luke himself. She moved toward the hearth, where he had prepared a small supper. The simplicity of the moment, a shared meal in the glow of firelight, made her heart ache with relief and hope. Luke watched her, his expression softening with a tenderness he rarely allowed himself to show anyone. There was no expectation, no pressure, only acceptance. For the first time since she had fled her old life, Clara allowed herself to breathe fully, to feel a sense of home in both place and presence. Her past still existed, its scars still whispered in the corners of her mind. But here, in the quiet hills with Luke, they no longer had power over her. She sat down, taking his hand in both of hers. His calloused fingers held hers firmly, reassuringly. "This is your place now," he said. "You don't have to hide, you don't have to fight, you just are." And for the first time, Clara believed it. The night settled over the cabin, the stars beginning to peek through the velvet sky. Outside, the hills were still, the wind soft and warm. Inside, there was laughter, quiet conversation, and the peace that comes from knowing you are finally seen and loved. In that cabin, Clara's heart found a refuge. Not because the world had changed, but because someone had chosen to stand by her side, unwavering, patient, and tender. And in that moment, she understood the simple truth of love. It wasn't rescue, it was a safe harbor, a place where a weary soul could finally be whole. The morning air on Bennett's Ridge was crisp and golden, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth. Clara Whitfield stood on the porch of the cabin, her hands resting lightly on the railing, watching the first rays of sunlight spill across the hills. It was a new day in more ways than one. For months, her life had been defined by running from family, from judgment, from the man who had tried to claim her as property. and from the fear that she would never belong anywhere. But here, with the wide-open sky above and the quiet strength of Luke Bennett beside her, she no longer felt the need to run. Luke emerged from the cabin behind her, a cup of steaming coffee in his hand. He leaned against the doorway, watching her with a calm smile, the way he always did. It was a smile that didn't demand anything of her except presence, that spoke of patience, understanding, and unwavering support. "You're quiet this morning," he said, voice low and gentle. Clara turned to him and smiled softly. "I'm thinking," she admitted, "thinking about everything. About how far I've come. About how I've survived." Luke nodded, taking a sip from his cup. "And?" She looked out over the hills, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance, the horses flicking their tails in the sunlight. "And I feel like I finally belong somewhere. Like I have a place I can call home, not because anyone else says I should, but because I'm allowed to be myself." Luke's eyes softened. "You've earned that," he said. "You didn't need anyone to hand it to you. You just needed the chance to grow into it." Clara's gaze drifted back to the cabin, the hearth, the small touches Luke had made to the home that reflected care and constancy. For the first time in years, she felt safe, not in the sense of being shielded from the world, but in the sense of being truly seen. The walls around her heart, built from years of shame, judgment, and fear, had begun to crumble, replaced by trust, understanding, and love that didn't demand perfection. The sound of movement behind her drew her attention. Luke's hand reached out and lightly brushed hers. The touch was familiar, grounding, yet it carried the promise of something more, a life built together, slowly, with honesty and tenderness. "You don't have to speak," Luke said softly. "Not yet?" She shook her head, a quiet laugh escaping her. "No," she said. "I don't. I think I understand now. Love isn't about rescue or fixing. It's about choosing to stay. About letting someone see you completely and still wanting to be near you." Luke smiled, and this time the smile was for both of them. It wasn't quiet, cautious, or restrained. It was full, unguarded, and warm. As the sun rose higher, Clara felt the final weight of her old life lift, leaving her unburdened. She could see the horizon, endless and full of possibility, and she knew that whatever challenges came, gossip, outsiders, or lingering shadows from the past, she would face them not alone, but with someone who truly understood her. That morning they walked together into the fields, Luke guiding the mare and Clara laughing at her unsteady balance, the sound echoing across the valley. It was a sound of freedom, of joy, and of love finally realized. The past, with its lies and betrayals, had not defined her. In the quiet of the rising sun, surrounded by hills and wide-open skies, Clara and Luke began a new chapter. A chapter where she could be wholly herself, where he could heal alongside her, and where love was measured not by perfection, but by the simple act of choosing to stay day after day. And in that new dawn, Clara finally understood what it meant to be truly home.